Have you ever felt a love slip away? Not with a fight, not with a word, but with a silence so deep it leaves you questioning everything? Welcome to ZenLight 8, where we uncover the quiet truths of the human heart through the lens of Stoic wisdom. Today, we're diving into the 2 subtle signs that reveal when someone's love for you is fading. Whispers of change you might miss if you're not paying attention. Stick around, because by the end, you'll not only spot these signs but also discover the strength to face them with unshakable peace. The first sign: they no longer share their inner world with you. Love does not always fade with a thunderclap or a storm of shouted words. More often, it slips away quietly, like a shadow retreating as the sun dips below the horizon. You might not notice it at first, not because it's hidden, but because it's subtle, a whisper instead of a scream. One day, you wake up next to someone you've loved for years, and though their face is the same, something essential is missing. The warmth that once colored their voice, the spark that lit their eyes when they spoke to you, it's gone. And in its place is a silence, not loud, not cruel, but heavy all the same. This is the first sign that love is leaving. They no longer share their inner world with you. Imagine a garden, lush and wild, filled with winding paths and hidden corners. It's a place where memories grow like flowers, where dreams take root, where fears and joys bloom side by side. To love someone is to be invited into that garden, to walk its trails, to sit beneath its trees and listen as they tell you what makes the flowers grow and what keeps the shadows at bay. In the beginning, they opened the gate wide. They showed you the colors of their thoughts, the shapes of their hopes, the quiet spaces where their worries rested. You didn't just hear their words, you felt their world. But now the gate is closed, not with a clang, not with a lock turned in anger, but slowly, silently, as if they forgot to leave it ajar. This retreat isn't always obvious. They don't announce it with a grand declaration. I no longer wish to let you in. No, it's gentler than that, and somehow more painful. One evening, you ask about their day, expecting the familiar cascade of details. The small frustrations, the fleeting joys, the random thoughts that once spilled out effortlessly. But instead, you get a nod, a shrug, a fine that hangs in the air like a closed door. The conversations that used to stretch late into the night, weaving through dreams and laughter, are now clipped, functional, safe. They tell you what you need to know. Dinner's ready, the bills are paid, but nothing more. The depth is gone, and with it, the connection that made you feel like you belonged to each other. Let me take you to a quiet town by the sea, where a woman named Clara learned this truth the hard way. Clara lived in a cottage perched on a cliff, the kind of place where the wind carried salt and stories. She shared that home with Daniel, a man whose hands were rough from fishing and whose heart, she thought, was as steady as the tides. For years, their evenings were a ritual of shared worlds. He'd come home smelling of the ocean, sit by the fire and tell her everything. The way the waves fought him that day, the gull that stole his bait, the strange thoughts that drifted through his mind as he cast his nets. She'd listen, adding her own tales, how the bakery ran out of flour, how the neighbor's cat slept on her porch again. It wasn't the grandness of the stories that mattered. It was the sharing, the way their words built a bridge between their souls. But then, something shifted. It wasn't sudden. No slamming doors, no raised voices, just a slow unraveling. Daniel still came home each night, still sat by the fire, but his words grew scarce. "How was your day?" Clara would ask, her voice soft with expectation. "Same as always," he'd reply, staring into the flames. At first, she thought he was tired. The sea could wear a man down, after all. She'd wait, give him time, try again the next day. But the silence stretched, and soon it wasn't just his day he stopped sharing. He no longer told her about the ache in his shoulders, the fleeting dream he'd had of a different life, the odd shape of a cloud he'd seen at noon. The man who once invited her into every corner of his mind now answered her questions with a nod, a grunt, a wall of quiet. Clara felt it like a cold wind creeping through the cracks of their home. She tried to pull him back. She'd ask more questions, tell longer stories of her own, hoping her openness would coax him out. One night, She sat across from him, the fire crackling between them, and asked, "What made you laugh today?" He looked at her, his brow furrowing as if the question confused him, then said, "Nothing, I guess." The room grew colder, not from the wind outside, but from the emptiness inside. She realized then that it wasn't exhaustion keeping him quiet. It was something deeper, something she couldn't name but could feel. He no longer wanted her in his world. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. But what do you do when there's nothing left to hear? When the person you love stops giving you anything to listen to?" Clara stood at the edge of her cliff one morning, the sea stretching out below her, and thought about that silence. She remembered how Daniel used to share everything, how his voice had been her anchor. Now it was as if he'd sailed away, leaving her on the shore with nothing but echoes. She didn't know why, not yet, but she knew what it meant. The gate to his garden had closed, and she was no longer welcome inside. This closing isn't always born of malice. Sometimes it's not even intentional. People don't stop sharing because they want to hurt you. They stop because they no longer feel the need to let you in. Maybe their thoughts have turned inward, curling around secrets or sorrows they're not ready to name. Maybe their dreams have shifted, and you no longer fit into the story they're telling themselves. Or maybe, as Marcus Aurelius might suggest, their heart has simply moved on. Not with anger, but with indifference, which cuts deeper than any blade. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. You're left knocking on a door that used to swing open at your touch, only to find it shut with no explanation offered. Think back to your own life. Have you ever felt this quiet withdrawal? Maybe it was a lover who once whispered their fears to you under the stars, only to grow distant, their answers shrinking to single words. Maybe it was a friend who used to call with every small triumph or stumble, but now lets days pass without a word. You keep reaching in, asking, offering, hoping to stir the connection back to life, but nothing comes back. It's not a fight you can win with louder words or grand gestures. It's a retreat you can only witness, and that's the hardest part. You're still in their life but no longer in their thoughts. In Clara's case, she began to see the signs everywhere. Daniel still ate the meals she cooked, still slept beside her, but his presence was a shell. One evening, she found an old letter he'd written her years ago, tucked in a drawer, a page full of scribbled thoughts about a storm he'd survived, how he'd thought of her the whole time. She held it, tracing the ink, and realized she couldn't remember the last time he'd shared anything so raw. Now, when she asked about the sea, he'd say, "It was rough," and leave it there. The man who once painted his world for her in vivid strokes had traded his brush for a blank canvas. The Stoics teach us that suffering comes not from the event itself, but from our judgment of it. Clara could have raged against Daniel's silence, demanded he open up, accused him of betrayal. But instead, she chose to listen, not to his words but to his absence. She sat with it, let it settle, and asked herself, "What does this mean?" The answer came not in a rush, but in a slow, steady understanding. His silence wasn't about her. It was about him. Wherever his heart had gone, it was no longer hers to follow. And in that realization, she found a strange kind of freedom. This is the first leaf falling, the first whisper of love's departure. When someone stops sharing their inner world, it's not just words they withhold. It's trust, intimacy, the invisible thread that ties two souls together. You might still see them every day, hear their voice, feel their presence, but you're no longer part of what matters most to them. Their joys, their frustrations, their small discoveries. They keep those for themselves now, or perhaps for someone else. And you're left with the shell of what was, wondering when the gate closed and why you didn't hear it shut. So what do you do when you see this sign? Do you pound on the door, begging to be let back in? Do you fill the silence with your own words, hoping they'll echo back? The Stoics would say no. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." You can't force someone to share their world with you, just as you can't force a flower to bloom in winter. Their retreat is theirs to choose, their gate theirs to close. Your strength lies not in chasing what's gone, but in standing still, in accepting what is. Clara didn't confront Daniel with tears or ultimatums. She didn't try to pry open what he'd locked away. Instead, she turned inward, tending her own garden, finding peace in the things she could control. Her thoughts, her days, herself. One morning, as the sun rose over the sea, Clara stood on her cliff again. The wind was sharp, the waves loud, but inside her was a quiet she hadn't felt in months. She looked out at the horizon and thought of Daniel, still asleep in their bed. She didn't hate him for his silence. She understood it now. It was his season changing, his leaves falling, and she couldn't stop the wind. But she could choose to let go, not with bitterness, but with grace. She could choose to walk her own path, to keep her own gate open to the world, even if his was closed to her. This is the first sign, and it's always there if you're willing to see it. They no longer share their inner world with you. The conversations dry up, the stories fade, the silence grows. It's not loud, it's not cruel, but it's clear. And when it comes, the question isn't how to make them speak again. It's how to listen to what their silence is telling you, and how to find your own voice in the quiet that follows. The second sign, they start comparing you silently. Love doesn't always fade with a single sharp break. Sometimes it drifts away quietly, leaving behind a trail of small, unspoken shifts that you only notice when you look back. One of those shifts, the second sign that love is slipping from someone's heart, is when they begin to compare you silently. It's not a loud accusation, not a pointed finger or a list of your flaws shouted across a room. No, it's subtler than that and somehow more piercing. It's in the way their eyes linger on someone else, the way their voice lifts when they speak of another's qualities, the way you feel measured against a standard they never name. When this happens, the admiration they once held for you starts to turn outward, and you're left wondering when you stopped being enough. Picture a marketplace at dusk, the air thick with the scent of bread and the hum of voices. You're walking side by side with someone you love, your steps falling into a rhythm that feels as natural as breathing. In the past, you'd stop at the same stalls, laugh at the same oddities. A misshapen apple, a merchant's exaggerated tale, and choose together what to bring home. But now their gaze drifts. It's not to the fruit or the trinkets, but to the people around you. A couple laughing by the baker's stand, a stranger with a confident stride, a woman in a dress that catches the fading light. They don't say anything, not out loud, but their silence speaks. You feel it. They're noticing something in others that they no longer see in you. This comparison isn't always cruel. They don't sit you down and tally up what you lack. No, it's quieter, almost unconscious. They might mention a friend's quick wit in passing, a coworker's endless energy, a stranger's effortless charm. And though the words seem harmless, there's a weight to them. It's as if they're holding up a mirror, not to reflect you, but to show you someone else's outline. The traits they once adored in you, the way you stumble over words when you're excited, the quiet way you care, the quirks they used to call endearing, seem to dim in their eyes. And in their place grows a restless admiration for what you can't offer, what you'll never be. Let me take you to a small hillside town, where a man named Theo learned this truth through the ache of silent glances. Theo was a carpenter, his hands rough from years of shaping wood, his life steady and simple. He lived with Mira, a woman whose laughter once filled their home like sunlight through open windows. For years, they'd built a life together. Shared meals, late-night talks, walks through the town square where they'd tease each other about the butcher's terrible jokes or the baker's burnt loaves. Mira had a way of seeing him, really seeing him, that made Theo feel like the best version of himself. She'd smile at his stubborn focus when he worked, call his quiet nature solid as oak, and rest her head on his shoulder as if it were the safest place in the world. But then, something changed. It wasn't a storm that swept through their home. No arguments, no betrayals, just a slow, creeping distance. Theo first noticed it one evening as they walked through the square. A young musician was playing near the fountain, his fingers dancing over the strings, his voice carrying a carefree joy. Myra's steps slowed, her eyes fixed on him, and though she didn't say a word, Theo saw it. A flicker of something in her expression, a quiet awe she hadn't turned toward him in months. Later, at home, she hummed the tune absent-mindedly, her voice soft but distant, as if she were somewhere else. "He's talented," she said offhandedly, and though the comment was small, it landed like a stone in Theo's chest. First, he brushed it off. People notice things, it's human, he told himself. But the moments kept piling up. At the market, she'd linger near a stall where a merchant spun tales with a grin Theo could never muster. "He's so lively," she'd murmur, almost to herself. On a walk, she'd nod toward a man carrying his child on his shoulders, a faint smile tugging at her lips, and Theo would feel it again, that unspoken measurement. She never criticized him, never said he wasn't enough, but her glances, her sighs, her fleeting comments told a story her words didn't. The man she'd once looked at with wonder was now a habit, a familiar shape beside her, while her eyes searched for something more. Theo felt the shift like a splinter under his skin. He'd catch her watching others with a light in her eyes he hadn't seen in ages, and it cut deeper than any argument ever could. He remembered how she used to laugh at his dry humor, how she'd tease him about his chipped front tooth and call it character. Now, those things seemed to fade from her view. She didn't mock him or push him away. She just stopped noticing him the way she once did. Instead, her attention drifted to strangers, to qualities he didn't possess. A louder laugh, a smoother voice, a life that sparkled where his was steady and plain. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Be content to seem what you really are." But what happens when the person you love is no longer content with who you are? When their heart begins to wander, not with malice, but with a quiet restlessness that leaves you feeling like a shadow of someone else. Theo sat in his workshop one night, the air thick with sawdust, and turned that question over in his mind. He ran his hands over a half-finished table, its edges rough like him, and wondered when Mira had stopped seeing its beauty or his. The pain wasn't in being replaced. It was in being measured, silently, against ideals he could never match. This silent comparison is a subtle beast. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in through glances, through pauses, through the way they light up at someone else's story but grow dim when you speak. You feel it in the way your presence becomes less a comfort and more a contrast. The laughter you once shared feels muted now. Your habits, once cherished, seem to grate on them. They don't say it, but you sense it. They're imagining someone else in your place, someone who fits the shape of a longing they won't name. And the worst part? You can't argue with silence. You can't fight a battle when the weapons are looks and size. Think of your own life. Have you ever walked beside someone you love and felt their eyes drift? Not with anger, but with curiosity. To someone else? Maybe it was a partner who once called your quirks charming, but now seems to admire the polish of others. Maybe it was a friend who used to lean on your steadiness, but now talks endlessly of someone more daring, more alive. You hear it in their tone, see it in their gaze. They're holding you up to a scale you didn't know existed, and you're coming up short. It's not loud, it's not cruel, but it's there. A whisper that says you're no longer the one they choose to see. For Theo, the truth settled in one quiet afternoon. They were at a neighbor's gathering, the room buzzing with voices. Mira stood across from him, her face bright as she listened to a man tell a story, some traveler with tales of far-off places. Her laughter rang out, sharp and clear, and Theo realized he hadn't heard that sound aimed at him in months. She didn't glance his way, didn't seek him out to share the moment. Instead, she stayed there, her eyes locked on the stranger, her delight spilling over for someone else. Theo didn't storm out or demand her attention. He just watched. And in that watching, he saw what he'd been avoiding. Her admiration had shifted. She wasn't his Mira anymore, not fully. She was a woman looking outward, comparing him to a world he couldn't give her. The Stoics teach us not to chase what lies beyond our control. We can't stop someone from turning their eyes elsewhere, from measuring us against dreams we can't fulfill. But we can choose not to measure ourselves in return. Theo could have spent his days trying to be louder, smoother, more like the men she noticed. He could have carved himself into someone else's shape, hoping to win back her gaze. But instead, he chose to stand as he was, rough-edged, quiet, real. Marcus Aurelius might have nodded at that choice. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Theo's strength wasn't in forcing Mira to see him again. It was in accepting that her comparisons were hers to carry, not his to fix. So what do you do when you feel this sign? When their eyes wander and their admiration fades? Do you chase after it, molding yourself into what you think they want? The Stoics would say no. Love built on comparison isn't love. It's performance, and you're not an actor. When someone silently weighs you against others, they stop seeing you as enough, not because you've changed, but because their heart has. Theo didn't beg Mira to look at him differently. He didn't try to outshine the strangers she admired. He simply let her drift, not with bitterness, but with a calm born of knowing his worth didn't depend on her gaze. One evening, Theo sat alone in his workshop, the light fading outside. He picked up a piece of wood, its grain uneven but strong, and ran his fingers over it. He thought of Mira, of the way her eyes used to find him in a crowd, of the way they didn't anymore. And he let it go, not her, not yet, but the need to be seen by her. He couldn't control where her heart turned, but he could control where he stood. The second leaf had fallen, the second sign was clear. She was comparing him silently, and in that silence, she was already walking away. This is the second whisper of love's departure. They start noticing what others have that you don't, and the admiration they once gave you slips through their fingers. It's not a loud goodbye. It's a gaze that no longer lingers, a heart that no longer chooses you. And when it comes, the task isn't to win it back. It's to let it go with grace, to stand whole in the quiet that remains. The Stoic response: mastering what you can control. Love, when it begins to fade, doesn't always leave with a dramatic exit. It often slips away quietly, a retreating tide that leaves the shore bare before you even notice the water's gone. You might see the signs, the silence where words once flowed, the glances that measure you against shadows you can't see, and feel the ache of it deep in your chest. The instinct is to fight, to reach out, to pull it back with trembling hands. But the Stoics, those ancient guides of the soul, offer a different path. They teach us that true peace comes not from resisting what we can't change, but from mastering what we can. When someone's love withdraws, the Stoic response is clear. We control only our own minds, not their feelings or actions. We must accept reality with calm rather than force love to return. And our suffering stems not from their departure, but from clinging to the hope that they must stay. Imagine a river cutting through a valley, its waters steady and sure. You've walked its banks for years with someone you love, watching the current carry leaves and light, feeling its rhythm match your own. But one day the river shifts. It carves a new path, leaving the old one dry, and though you stand there still, the water no longer flows beside you. Do you chase it, digging at the earth to force it back? Do you shout at the sky for letting it change? Or do you stand on the bank, watching it go, and find a stillness in the letting go? The Stoics, Marcus Aurelius with his quiet strength, Epictetus with his sharp clarity, would choose the latter. They'd tell you the river's course isn't yours to command, but your footing is. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who ruled an empire yet wrestled with his own heart, wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." It's a simple truth, but one that cuts through the chaos of loss. When someone pulls away, when their voice grows quiet or their eyes turn elsewhere, it's easy to feel powerless. You can't reach into their soul and turn their love back on like a lantern in the dark. You can't bind their heart to yours with words or tears. Their feelings, their choices, they're beyond your grasp, as distant as the stars. But your mind, that's yours. You can choose how to see it, how to bear it, how to stand when the ground beneath you shifts. Let me take you to a dusty village at the edge of a desert, where a woman named Amina learned this lesson under a relentless sun. Amina was a weaver, her hands skilled at threading patterns into cloth, her life woven tightly with a man named Karim. He was a trader, always returning from distant markets with stories and spices, his voice a thread that ran through their days. For years, they'd sit under the stars, her loom resting beside her, as he spoke of caravans and storms, of bartering with strangers and dreaming of the sea. She'd share her own small world, the way the wool caught the light, the neighbor's gossip, the quiet joy of a perfect stitch. Their love was a tapestry, rich and alive, each thread a piece of the other. But then the threads began to fray. Karim still came home, his bags heavy with goods, but his stories grew thin. Where he once poured out every detail, he now offered only fragments. It was hot, the road was long, and his eyes seemed to look past her. She saw him linger at the well one day, watching a group of travelers with a spark she hadn't seen in months. He'd laugh at their tales, nod at their boldness, and return to her with a silence that felt like a wall. Amina felt it. The love she'd known was slipping away, not with anger, but with a quiet drift she couldn't stop. At first, she resisted. She'd ask more questions, weave brighter cloth to catch his eye, cook his favorite meals as if flavor could pull him back. "Tell me about the market," she'd say, her voice trembling with hope. "Same as always," he'd reply, his gaze on the horizon. She'd lie awake beside him, listening to his breathing, wondering what she'd done wrong, what she could do to make him see her again. The pain wasn't in his distance. It was in her clinging, her desperate belief that if she tried harder, loved louder, he'd turn back. She was chasing a river that had already changed its course, and it was tearing her apart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the dunes, Amina walked to the edge of the village. The air was still, the sand stretching out like an endless sea. She sat there, alone, and thought of Karim, of the man he'd been, of the man he was becoming. Her heart ached. But then she remembered something she'd heard from an old traveler, a man who'd spoken of the Stoics under a flickering fire. Epictetus said freedom is letting go of what you can't control, he told her. You can't hold the wind, but you can choose how to face it. The words lingered, sharp and clear, and Amina turned them over like stones in her hands. She couldn't control Karim's heart, couldn't force his stories back to her, couldn't make him stay. But she could control herself, her thoughts, her actions, her peace. Epictetus, that unyielding voice of reason, once said, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life, and it is achieved by letting go of what is outside our control." Amina sat with that truth as the stars emerged, pinpricks of light in a vast dark. She realized her suffering didn't come from Karim's withdrawal. It came from her expectation that he must keep loving her, that his heart owed her its warmth. She'd been fighting a battle she couldn't win, not because she was weak, but because it wasn't hers to fight. His feelings were his, as free as the wind over the dunes, and no amount of pleading could tether them to her. But her mind, her strength, those were hers to wield, so she stopped chasing. Not all at once, it wasn't a clean break, but slowly, deliberately. She still cooked for him, still sat beside him, but she no longer begged for his words. She'd ask a question and let his silence hang, not filling it with her own desperate noise. She'd weave her cloth, not for his approval, but for the quiet joy it brought her. One night, as he stared into the fire, she watched him, not with longing, but with a calm curiosity. She saw a man drifting away, not out of spite, but out of his own shifting seasons. And instead of pulling him back, she let him go. Not from their home, not yet, but from the grip of her expectations. Marcus Aurelius might have smiled at that choice. He wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." Amina's thoughts had been a storm. Why doesn't he see me? What's wrong with me? How do I fix this? But now she turned them to stillness. She couldn't change Karim's heart, but she could change how she met its absence. She began to rise each morning not for him, but for herself, threading her loom, walking the village, breathing the desert air. The pain didn't vanish. It lingered like a bruise, but it softened. She wasn't suffering from his silence anymore. She was living beside it. Think of your own life. Have you ever felt someone pulling away, their love fading like a fire gone to embers? Maybe it was a partner who stopped reaching for your hand, a friend who no longer sought your counsel, a parent whose pride turned to indifference. Your first urge is to fight it, to ask why, to prove your worth, to cling to what was. But the Stoics would ask, what can you control here? Not their heart, not their words, not their choice to stay or go. Only your own response, whether you chase a shadow or stand in the light you still hold. Amina learned this the hard way, but it set her free. One afternoon, as she sat weaving under the shade of a tamarisk tree, Karim passed by. He paused, watching her hands move over the loom, and for a moment, she thought he might speak. He didn't, just nodded and walked on. In the past, that silence would have broken her, sent her spiraling into questions and pleas. But now, she let it pass like a breeze through the branches. She didn't need his voice to fill her world anymore. She had her own. The Stoics teach that suffering isn't the event. It's our judgment of it. When someone withdraws, the ache doesn't come from their leaving. It comes from believing they shouldn't, that their love is yours to keep. Amina stopped judging Karim's distance as a wound she had to heal. She accepted it as a truth she couldn't change. And in that acceptance, she found a strength she didn't know she had. She didn't demand answers or force warmth where it had gone cold. She simply lived, fully, quietly, on her own terms. So what do you do when love fades and the signs are clear? Do you cling tighter, hoping your grip can hold what's slipping away? Or do you open your hands, not in defeat, but in courage? The Stoic path isn't easy. It asks you to face the river's new course, to stand on the dry bank and choose peace over struggle. Amina didn't stop loving Karim, not entirely, but she stopped needing him to love her back. She rose each day, wove her patterns, walked her path, because her life was still hers, even if he'd stepped out of it. One evening, as the desert sky burned red, Amina stood at the village edge again. The wind carried sand and silence, and she thought of the river, of how it flows where it will, not where you wish. She thought of Marcus Aurelius, of Epictetus, of their words like lanterns in the dark. She couldn't control Karim's heart, but she could control her own. And in that control, she found not just survival but freedom. A freedom to let go with grace, to live with dignity, to be whole even when the tapestry unraveled. This is the Stoic response. Accept what is, release what isn't yours, and root your peace in the one thing no one can take: yourself. When love withdraws, don't chase it into the shadows. Stand where you are, steady as the earth, and let it go, not because you don't care, but because you do. Lessons from Elias. The strength in letting go. Love doesn't always announce its departure with a clash of thunder or a storm of tears. More often, it fades like the light of a dying day, quietly, gradually, until you're left standing in the dusk, wondering when the warmth slipped away. For Elias, a humble farmer in a village cradled by tall hills, this truth unfolded not through betrayal or bitter words, but through a silence that grew heavier with each passing season. His story, simple yet profound, teaches us that when love begins to leave, the greatest lessons come not from holding on, but from letting go. Through the stillness of his wife Lina's retreat and the wisdom of a solitary figure called the Watcher, Elias discovered that observing trumps forcing, acceptance outshines struggle, and releasing what's gone isn't weakness. It's a strength that preserves your worth and restores your peace. Picture a small house at the edge of a field, its walls weathered by time, its roof kissed by the sun each morning. Elias lived there with Lina, the woman who'd been his anchor through years of planting and harvest. Their life wasn't grand, no ballads would be sung of it, but it was theirs. Evenings were filled with shared glances over a rough-hewn table, mornings with quiet laughter as they tended the garden, nights with whispers that wove their hearts closer. Elias believed their bond was as enduring as the hills around them, etched into the rhythm of their days. But love, like all things in nature, has its seasons, and one autumn he felt the air change. Not outside, but within their home. It began with small things so faint he almost missed them. Lina no longer waited by the door when he came in from the fields, her silhouette absent against the fading light. Meals were still prepared, but left on the table without a word, the steam rising alone where her smile once greeted him. "How was your day?" he'd ask, expecting the familiar spill of her thoughts. The flowers she'd tended, the wind that tangled her hair, the stray thoughts that danced through her mind. But her answers grew short, fine, tiring, and her eyes, once warm and searching, wandered elsewhere. At first, Elias chalked it up to the season. The days were shorter, the air colder. Maybe she was just weary. But as weeks turned to months, the silence deepened, and a space opened between them, vast and unbridgeable. He tried to pull her back. He brought home her favorite bread from the market, its crust still warm, hoping it would spark the old joy in her face. He spent extra hours in the garden, coaxing flowers to bloom out of season, thinking the colors might draw her near. He even dug out a poem she'd once loved, reading it aloud by the fire, his voice trembling with the weight of memory. But her smiles were no longer real. They were polite, distant, the kind you offer a stranger passing through. Elias felt like a ghost in his own home, present but unseen, his efforts fading into the growing quiet. Lina was still there, cooking, cleaning, sleeping beside him, but she wasn't there. Her heart had retreated, and he couldn't reach it. Lost and unsure, Elias turned to the only place he could think of, the forest beyond the village. It was said that deep within, where the sun struggled to pierce the canopy, lived a man known as the Watcher. He wasn't a sage with grand titles or a healer with potions. He was simply a man who'd loved, lost, and chosen solitude over despair. People sought him not for solutions but for perspective, and Elias needed that now more than ever. One morning, he packed a small bag and walked into the trees, the crunch of leaves underfoot mirroring the fracture in his chest. He found the Watcher on a wooden bench outside a modest cottage, his eyes tracing the slow fall of autumn leaves. The old man said nothing at first, just motioned for Elias to sit, and for a long while, they watched the world shed its colors in silence. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice rough with the weight of weeks. "I think she no longer loves me, but I can't prove it. She's still there, but I'm alone." The Watcher nodded, his gaze steady on the spiraling leaves. "When the wind changes, the leaves fall," he said simply. "They don't ask permission. They don't explain. They just know the season's done." Elias frowned, his hands tightening into fists. "So what do I do? How do I know for sure?" The Watcher picked up a brittle leaf from the bench and held it up, its edges curling inward. "Love doesn't leave with loud footsteps. It fades like this. First the edges, then the color, then it breaks away. The signs are there, but they whisper. You have to listen." Elias followed the old man's gaze to a towering tree at the clearing's edge, its branches swaying in the breeze. "This tree's been here longer than me," the Watcher said. "Each year, it lets go of what no longer serves it. Not with anger, not with sorrow, but with wisdom." He turned, pressing the leaf into Elias's palm. "If you want to know if love's left, don't force her to say it. Don't demand what she can't give. Just watch. The signs will come, and when they do, you won't need to ask, you'll know." In that moment, surrounded by trees shedding what they couldn't hold, Elias felt a truth settle into him. Love, like the seasons, changes, and fighting it only breaks you more. When he returned to the village, Elias carried that lesson with him. He watched Lina, not with the frantic hope of before, but with a quiet clarity. She was there, as always, moving through their home, but the emptiness was unmistakable. She cooked, she spoke when spoken to, but the depth was gone. Conversations that once meandered through dreams and fears were now clipped, efficient, like a gate slamming shut. One evening, he asked what made her smile that day, a question that used to spark a cascade of light in her eyes. She paused, brow furrowing, then said, "Nothing, I guess." The room felt colder, but Elias didn't push. He saw it now. The gate to her inner world was closed, and no amount of knocking would open it. The Watcher's words echoed. "Observe, don't force." Elias stopped trying to drag her back. He didn't plead for her thoughts or beg for her warmth. Instead, he let the silence speak, let the distance grow, and in that space he found something new. Not answers, but acceptance. He'd spent weeks wrestling with the change, trying to bend it to his will, but now he saw it for what it was. Lioness' heart had shifted, not because of him, but because of her. And he couldn't control that, any more than he could stop the leaves from falling. This acceptance wasn't surrender, it was strength. The Watcher had shown him that clinging to a love already gone didn't prove devotion. It eroded dignity. You can't force a leaf to stay on a branch that no longer feeds it, the old man had said, and Elias understood. Lioness wasn't his to hold. Not her heart, not her spirit. She was a season passing, and his task wasn't to trap her in winter, but to let her go with the grace of autumn. So he chose himself. He still rose with the sun, still worked his fields, still ate the meal she left, but he stopped waiting for her to return to him. He stopped searching her face for the love he'd lost. He lived not for her, but for the life that was still his. One morning, Elias stood at the edge of his land, the air crisp with the promise of frost. The fields stretched out before him, rows of earth he'd tended with his own hands, and beyond them, the hills stood silent and eternal. He caught his reflection in the window of their home. Not a man abandoned, but a man standing firm. Letting go hadn't weakened him. It had fortified him. It was the strength to see reality without flinching, to hold his worth when someone else couldn't, to find peace in a world that kept turning. Lioness was still there, in body if not in spirit, but Elias was no longer tethered to her absence. He was free not from her but from the need to make her stay. The Stoics might call this the highest form of courage. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." And Elias's thoughts had shifted. He no longer saw Lioness' withdrawal as a wound to heal or a puzzle to solve. It was a fact like the wind or the rain, and his power lay in how he met it. Epictetus, too, would nod. Freedom is letting go of what you can't control. Elias couldn't control Lioness' heart, but he could control his own, his actions, his purpose, his peace. And in that control, he found a stillness that outlasted the ache. Think of your own life. Have you ever stood where Elias did, watching someone you love drift away? Not with a goodbye, but with a silence that says it all? Maybe it was a partner whose warmth turned to routine, a friend whose laughter found a new audience, a family member whose pride faded to indifference. The urge is to fight, to demand they see you, to prove you're still enough. But Elias's story asks, what if you stopped fighting? What if you observed instead of forced, accepted instead of resisted, chose yourself instead of chasing what's gone? It's not weakness, it's power, the power to stand whole when the world shifts beneath you. Elias didn't return to the Watcher with a triumphant tale of winning Lioness back. He didn't need to. The lesson wasn't in reclaiming her, it was in reclaiming himself. One day, as he walked his fields, he thought of the leaf in his palm, brittle but complete. Letting go didn't mean he hadn't loved her. It meant he'd loved enough to honor her freedom, and his own. The hills still stood, the sun still rose, and Elias still lived, not as a man diminished, but as a man made stronger by release. This is the lesson from Elias. When love fades through silence and distance, don't break yourself trying to hold it. Watch it, accept it, and choose yourself. Buong Bo isn't defeat. It's the strength to keep your roots deep, your head high, and your peace intact, even as the leaves fall around you. Practical advice. Standing firm when love fades. Love doesn't always end with a loud crash or a tear-streaked farewell. Sometimes it slips away quietly, like a river drying up one drop at a time, leaving you on a bank you didn't choose. You might notice the signs silence where there was once connection, glances that weigh you against others, and feel the urge to fight, to plead, to reshape yourself into something they'll stay for. But here's the practical truth, rooted in the calm wisdom of the Stoics. When you see these signs, don't beg for attention or try to change someone else. Stand tall, choose yourself, and live your life fully. Love can shift or fade, but you must never lose yourself in the scramble to hold it. This isn't just philosophy. It's a way to walk through the world when the ground beneath you trembles. Imagine a coastal town, where the sea whispers against the rocks and the days unfold with the rhythm of the tides. There lived Nora, a woman who ran a small shop selling shells and woven baskets. her hands steady from years of crafting. She shared her life with Sam, a fisherman whose rough voice once carried tales of the ocean into their home. For years, their evenings were a dance of shared moments, her laughter at his exaggerated stories, his quiet nods as she spoke of the day's small triumphs. Their love was simple, built on the give and take of two lives intertwined. But seasons change, and so do hearts, and Nora began to feel the shift. Not in a single moment, but in a slow, creeping tide. It started with the silence. Sam still came home each night, his boots heavy with salt, but the stories stopped. "How was the sea?" she'd ask, expecting the familiar flood of words. "Rough," he'd say, his eyes on the floor, and that was all. Then came the glances, subtle but sharp. At the docks, she'd catch him watching a young couple, their hands linked, their laughter bright, a flicker of something in his face she hadn't seen in months. He'd comment on a neighbor's energy, a friend's quick wit, his tone light but loaded, and Nora felt it. He was measuring her against shadows she couldn't match. The warmth he'd once turned toward her was drifting elsewhere, and she was left standing in the cold. At first, Nora fought it. She'd linger by the door when he returned, hoping a smile would pull him back. She'd ask more questions, weave brighter baskets, cook richer stews. Anything to spark the old light in his eyes. "Tell me something good," she'd say, her voice tight with need. "Not much to tell," he'd reply, and the room would grow heavier. She'd watch him at the market, his gaze lingering on others, and feel herself shrinking. Why wasn't she enough? The more she pushed, the more he pulled away, and the more she lost herself in the trying. She was begging for his attention, molding herself to fit a shape he no longer saw, and it was breaking her. One evening, as the sun sank into the sea, Nora walked to the shore alone. The waves lapped at her feet, steady and indifferent, and she stood there, the weight of weeks pressing down. She thought of Sam, of his silence, his wandering eyes, and felt the ache of it all. But then, a memory surfaced, something she'd heard from a passing sailor who'd spoken of the Stoics under a salt-crusted sky. "You can't control the wind," he'd said, "but you can steer your own ship." The words hit her like a wave, clear and cold. She couldn't make Sam talk, couldn't force his heart to stay, couldn't change the way he saw her. But she could change how she met it. She could stop begging, stop bending, and start standing. This is the first piece of practical advice. Don't beg for attention or try to change them. When you see the signs, silence where there was once depth, comparisons that leave you lacking, resist the urge to chase. Nora could have kept pleading, kept reshaping herself into someone Sam might notice again. But what would it gain her? A hollow victory, a love coerced rather than chosen. The Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius, would call that a waste of power. "You have power over your mind, not outside events," he wrote, and Nora took it to heart. She stopped hovering by the door, stopped filling his silence with her own desperate words. She let him be, not out of spite, but out of a quiet resolve to stop pouring herself into a cup that wouldn't hold her. Instead, she chose herself. She returned to her shop the next morning, not for Sam's approval, but for her own. She polished the shells, wove her baskets, greeted her customers with a smile that wasn't forced. She walked the shore at dusk, not to mourn what was slipping away, but to feel the sand under her feet, the air in her lungs. She cooked meals she loved, sat in the quiet she'd once feared, and found it wasn't empty. It was hers. This is the second piece of advice. Stand firm and live your life fully. Love might fade, but your days don't. Nora didn't need Sam's voice to fill them. She had her own rhythm, her own purpose, and she leaned into it with a strength she'd forgotten she had. The truth is, love can change or end, and that's not a failure. It's a fact. Sam wasn't the man he'd been, not to her, and Nora couldn't rewind the tide. But losing his love didn't mean losing herself, and that's the final piece of advice. Don't let the effort to keep it cost you who you are. She'd spent weeks twisting herself into knots, trying to be brighter, louder, more, anything to win him back. But in that chase, she'd lost the woman who laughed freely, who crafted with care, who stood steady against the sea. The Stoics would see that as the real tragedy, not his withdrawal but her surrender to it. Epictetus said, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life," and Nora found hers not in holding Sam, but in holding herself. One afternoon, as she sat in her shop, a customer lingered. A woman who admired a basket's weave, her eyes bright with curiosity. "You made this?" she asked, and Nora nodded, a small pride warming her chest. They talked about the craft, the sea, the small joys of the day, and for the first time in months, Nora felt seen, not by Sam, but by herself. She glanced out the window and saw him pass by. His head turned toward the docks, and she didn't flinch. She didn't need his gaze to know her worth. It was in her hands, her voice, her life. He could drift, compare, withdraw, but she wouldn't follow him into the shadows. This is the Stoic way. When someone no longer loves you, they'll retreat from your world and measure you against others. But you don't have to break yourself to bridge the gap. Nora learned to accept it, not with bitterness, but with dignity. She saw Sam's silence and wandering eyes for what they were. His choices, his seasons, and let them be. She didn't demand answers or plead for a return to what was. She stood where she was, whole and unshaken, and turned her energy inward, to the strength that had always been there, waiting. Think of your own life. Have you ever felt love slipping away? Maybe a partner whose warmth turned to routine, a friend whose admiration found a new home? Did you beg for their attention, try to become what you thought they wanted, only to feel smaller with every effort? Nora's story offers a different path. Stop chasing, start choosing. When the signs appear, don't lower yourself to fit their fading vision. Lift yourself to live your own. Cook the meal you love, walk the path that calls you, build the life that's yours, not because they'll see it, but because you do. One evening, as the sea glowed under a crescent moon, Nora stood at her shop's door. Sam came home late, his steps heavy, his voice absent, and she didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't need to, her world no longer hinged on his. She closed the door behind her, the air cool against her skin, and thought of the Stoics, of Marcus Aurelius's calm, of Epictetus's clarity. Love could end, but she wouldn't. She'd lost Sam's heart, but not her own, and in that truth, she found a peace deeper than any plea could offer. This is the practical advice in action. When love fades, don't cling to its ghost. Accept it with grace, release it with strength, and focus on the one thing no one can take: yourself. Nora didn't beg Sam to stay, didn't twist herself to fit his silence. She stood firm, chose her life, and lived it fully, not as a shadow of what was, but as a light of what could be. The Stoics would call that victory, not over him, but over the chaos within. And in that victory, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. And so, we come to the end of this journey, a quiet walk through the fading of love, guided by the steady light of Stoic wisdom. We've seen the signs, the silence that closes the gate to their inner world, the glances that measure you against shadows you can't reach. We've learned from Elias and Nora, from the farmer and the weaver, that love's departure doesn't have to break us. It can teach us. When someone no longer loves you, they'll withdraw and compare. But your strength lies not in chasing them back, but in standing firm. Accept what is, release what isn't yours, and choose yourself. Not with bitterness, but with the dignity of a heart that knows its worth. This is the Stoic way, to live fully, even when the path beside you empties, to find peace not in holding on, but in letting go. Now I turn to you wherever you are, sitting by a window, walking ashore, or resting in the quiet of your own space. Have you seen these signs in your own life? Felt the stillness where words once flowed? Sensed the comparisons that left you questioning? Take a moment to reflect. What did you do? Did you fight or did you release? Did you lose yourself or find yourself? I invite you to share your story in the comments below. Tell us how you faced the silence, how you stood through the drift, because your voice doesn't just heal you, it lights the way for others. Wisdom isn't just in these words, it's in the living of them, in the sharing of what we've learned. To every one of you at ZenLight 8 who's watched this video to the end, I want to offer my deepest, most sincere thanks. You've given your time, your attention, your presence, and that means more than I can say. This channel isn't just a voice. It's a community, a place where we seek truth together, where we grow through the quiet and the storm. Thank you for being here, for walking this path with me, for choosing to look inward when the world pulls outward. If this spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need it, because light spreads when we carry it forward. Until next time, keep standing, keep choosing yourself, and may you find peace in every step. From the heart of Zenlight 8, thank you truly.